Hello, Mr. Caleb Maupin, and thank you very much indeed for joining us in this program.
Glad to be here as always.
How do you view Iran's foreign ministry saying U.S. officials must know that illusions do not have any place in nuclear talks with Tehran?
Well, it's very clear that in many cases when the U.S. enters into negotiations, these negotiations are simply, a way for the U.S. to kind of force its agenda. Often in U.S. media, for example, they refer to whatever the United States wants as the peace process. And if a country doesn't simply go along with what the United States says, they're, quote, rejecting the peace process. Often the way negotiations are portrayed, it's as if a country should simply do whatever the United States wants, or else it's not cooperating in negotiations. And that's often the way the discourse is played. But currently, Iran is developing peaceful nuclear energy, and they have the absolute right to do that. And much U.S. media is presenting this as if somehow Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons, and that all of that is completely false. It's completely been debunked. There is no basis for anyone to believe that Iran is a threat to anyone. And so, there's a lot of propaganda going on. There's a lot of attempts to influence the public mind, but overwhelmingly, negotiations are a step forward. It is to the benefit of everyone in the world, whether working people in the United States, people in the Middle East, people in Africa and Asia, for the sanctions on Iran to be ended, and for people to in the world to have diplomacy and to get along, and that the real thrust behind the attacks on Iran, the sanctions, the attempts to isolate Iran, the thrust behind that is the Israelis, the Zionists, and the wealthy Wall Street bankers and oil corporations. They're the only ones who want to isolate Iran. The people of the world are striving for peace, and a step toward peace and negotiation and diplomacy between nations is ending these ugly sanctions that are attacking the Iranian people.
Why does Washington have illusions, as the foreign ministry says, about Iran's nuclear program at a time when Iran has been crystal clear about its activities?
Well, one leader of Nazi Germany, Joseph Goebbels, once said that if you repeat a lie long enough and loud enough, people will believe it. And that is essentially what the United States is doing. It continues to repeat this falsehood that somehow Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons. That is a lie and a falsehood. Iran has no interest in developing nuclear weapons. Iran has complied fully with the International Atomic Energy Agency, with all of the treaties, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and obeyed everything. But still, the United States continues its hostility and bases this hostility, justifies it in people's minds with this lie, this claim that Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons, which to anyone who actually looks into the situation is overwhelmingly false. Iran has absolutely no interest in developing nuclear weapons. It has taken absolutely no steps in that direction. It has only developed peaceful nuclear energy, which is something countless countries all over the world have, which Iran has a right to have. And it's clear that as these lies get repeated, that peace can't go forward. Negotiations, diplomacy, things can't get better if these lies and illusions and falsehoods continue to be part of the conversation. If that becomes part of the conversation, if that continues to be part of the conversation, it's going to be very hard to move forward toward peace, and that's a point of frustration.
And of course, what will happen, Mr. Maupin, if Washington breaks and violates the Geneva deal? What can we expect from Iran?
Well, that's interesting because, the U.S. is constantly talking about the peace process, constantly talking about, we're engaging in the peace process. And, and the Iranians have been more than accommodating. President Rouhani spoke at the United Nations talking about a world against violence and extremism. There's been negotiations. There's been peace. There's been, Iran is doing everything it can to try and promote peace and cooperation and understanding between countries in the world and oppose the wave of violence and extremism that's going on around the world. And it's clear that, the United States, for its continued support of the insurgent groups in Syria, which are murdering children every day, it's clear that the United States has a different objective. But yet, in the media, there's talk of the peace process. The peace process has just become a synonym for what the United States wants, and that's simply a false way of viewing the situation. But that's the way the Western media and that's the way U.S. officials are trying to present it. If Iran doesn't immediately do whatever the United States wishes, it's rejecting peace. And that's simply false. It's the United States that is rejecting peace as it continues to arm and fund the Syrian insurgent groups that behead people. It's the United States that is rejecting peace which is continuing sanctions against the Iranian people, causing horrendous economic problems there. It is the United States, with its continued support of Israel, giving $180 million every day to the state of Israel. I mean, it's the United States that is supporting war and aggression and conflict around the world. And Iran has proved that it is a country that wants peace. Iran has never attacked another country violently. Iran is a peace-loving country that wants the peaceful development of the peoples of the Middle East and cooperation. And the media in the United States is really portraying things the opposite of how they actually are.
Yeah. And one final question, very briefly, Mr. Maupin. How should we regard and view some contradictory remarks from the part of U.S. administration officials? Sometimes they're talking about the diplomacy, sometimes they threaten Iran. Is it for domestic consumption or for Zionist lobby consumption? How should Iran react to such a contradictory remarks?
Well, U.S. officials, it's overwhelmingly clear if you look into it, the U.S. officials aren't accountable to the people of the United States, mostly. They're very, very much accountable to the Zionist Israel lobby, and they are also very, very accountable to the bankers and the corporations and those who profit from oil and from war and from foreign interventions. So as peace moves ahead, Obama and the government administration, they're in a touchy situation. Because while the people of the world are overwhelmingly wanting peace, and while they have to at least look like they're moving in that direction, or else they'll be completely rejected by all the peoples of the world, including the people of the United States, while they have to look like they're moving toward peace, the people that they're actually serving don't want peace. The people that they're actually serving, the Wall Street corporations, the Zionist Israeli lobby, these other groups, they want war, and they're committed to war, and they've made that overwhelmingly clear. So it's a very difficult situation for U.S. officials where they have to, on the one hand, look like they're trying to create peace. On the other, the people that they're accountable don't want peace. So it's a frustrating situation, and you're hearing all kinds of contradictory words coming out of the mouths of people in the United States. I mean, look at the Syria situation. In Syria, the U.S. is always talking about we need to end the fighting, but they continue to send weapons and guns and all kinds of support to these Syrian insurgent groups. This war would have been over. The Syrian conflict would have been over months and months and months ago if it were not for the continued U.S. support, Western support for the insurgent groups. Yet they get up every day and talk about how they want peace. They want peace. So they're talking in two different languages. They're speaking in two different tones. They're telling people what they want to hear, but they're also carrying out the policies that serve the ends of the Israeli lobby and of Washington, D.C. and the Wall Street bankers. So, we're seeing a contradiction, and the words of U.S. officials are often contradictory.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us in this program, Mr. Caleb Maupin.
We're glad to be here as always, so thank you.